Hello students. When someone presents an argument, they'll use a whole bunch of language choices, persuasive techniques, tone of voice, and many other things in order to persuade us, to be convincing. And it's important that we're able to analyze that we're able to take in that information, process it, and understand what's going on. So in this video, I'm going to teach you a structure that can be helpful for you to analyze persuasive arguments. And that structure is easy to remember with the three words, what, how, why. So here you can see the what, how, why structure. We start with what. Let me grab my highlighter here. Oh, that's not the highlighter. We start with what. What is the writer saying? What point are they trying to make? What is the key argument in this specific part of what might be a bigger argument? So it might be a two-page article you're reading, and when you zoom in on just one paragraph or maybe even just a sentence or two, you need to ask, what idea is the writer presenting here? What point are they trying to make? So that's the first thing. Then we move on to how. How are they expressing that argument? How are they trying to convince you? They might be making language choices. So don't overcomplicate it. Sometimes you can just say, look, they've used that word over that one. They've said must instead of could. What choices, what words have they used in order to present their idea? What persuasive techniques have they used? You might be able to identify specific persuasive devices like emotive language, rhetorical questions, use of facts and figures. So what specific persuasive techniques have they used? What tone are they writing or speaking in? Are they really aggressive? Are they being friendly? Are they using humor? Are they being emphatic? Are they being laissez-faire? Right? If you can identify a specific tone, that can be a way that the writer has how the writer has tried to convey their idea. And also, are there any audio or visual elements? So if it's a presentation, have they included some slides or multimedia? If it's an article, is there a graphic or a cartoon or something to go along with that? So any visual elements or anything you can hear can also go along with that. So we've got what is the main point they're presenting? What is the argument they're getting across? How are they doing that? And then finally, and I think students often find this the trickiest, but it's really important, you say, why? Why is the writer doing this? What impact do they hope to have on their audience? And it's really about that word impact. What effect are they hoping to have on the reader or audience? In particular, how does it position the audience to agree with the writer's contention? Right? This is an argument. Everything they're doing is designed to persuade you, to convince you to agree with them. So why have they included this particular argument here? How does that work to convince you to agree with their contention? So let's have a look at this in action. Here I have an example. Imagine there's an article, so you've got to imagine that it's part of a bigger article. I've just given a very brief example. Imagine there's an article, and the article's all about the need for harsher punishments for youth offenders who commit acts of violence. So that is the overall contention of this pretend article that you have not got in front of you. And one paragraph, one very short paragraph, maybe right near the start of the article, says, over the weekend, we heard yet another story of an innocent bystander who had their face shredded by broken glass when a drunken idiot lost control. How long are we going to let this continue? So this is the paragraph we're going to analyze. And the first thing to do is to grab a highlighter. I've got my digital highlighter here, and to just read it carefully and think, what stands out to me? So first of all, one thing that stands out to me is that they describe the innocent bystander and the drunken idiot. I think that's a pretty interesting use of really emotive language, that they describe the victim as an innocent bystander, I'll highlight the word bystander, and the perpetrator as a drunken idiot. That's some interesting language use. I also noticed the really intense language of shredded by broken glass. They could have described that differently. They could have said cut, right? That would have been neutral language, but the word shredded has a really a high impact. It's emotive. And then I also notice in the second sentence three things actually. This idea of how long. This really gets across the idea of urgency, that we can't let this continue. I notice the word we, inclusive language, sort of putting the pressure on us to make the change. And finally, the fact that it's a question, but not a question that really requires an answer. It's a rhetorical question, because no one wants to let this sort of violence just continue. So we've got a rhetorical question with a sense of urgency, how long, and using inclusive language by saying we, putting the responsibility on us. So there's even more we could talk about, but there's a few good things to get us started. So in the next slide, I'm going to run through how I've applied this, and I've used some quotes, things that I've highlighted here, to write a what, how, why analysis. So here it is. What is the writer trying to do in this paragraph? What point are they making? Well, the writer contends that we must take decisive action to put an end to random acts of violence. I think that's the main point. I've said decisive action. That rhetorical question at the end really does that. And ultimately, the bigger contention is all about ending random acts of violence, of having harsher penalties. So that's what I think they're trying to achieve in this particular paragraph. It's a bit hard to write the what without a bigger example, but I think that's a reasonable summary of the main point that the writer was trying to make in the previous slide in that paragraph. So how do they try to convince us that we need decisive action and to put a stop to this? Let me read it to you, and as I go, I'll highlight some particular things. So if you want to pause and just read it through first, that's fine. I'm going to read and sort of commentate as well. So how do they achieve this point? They do this by using emotive language. So I've identified a particular persuasive technique there to position us, to make the audience stand on a particular side, to position us to feel sympathetic towards the victim and critical of the perpetrator. So I've got some good language there. Sympathetic, critical. In some ways, this is really the why, but I'm blending in the sort of reason as I describe it. Describing the victim as an innocent bystander. Notice that I've peppered in my quotes. I've got brief quotes that flow in my own sentences. Describing the victim as an innocent bystander makes us feel sympathetic towards them, as they didn't deserve to get injured. And we may also feel fear, as it could happen to anyone. Saying that their face was shredded, again, I'm peppering in that quote, integrating it into my own writing. Saying that their face was shredded is very graphic and shocks the reader. We're encouraged to feel disapproval and even anger towards the perpetrator, as they committed this senseless crime, right? It was against an innocent bystander, so it was unprovoked, a senseless crime, and they're dismissed as nothing more than a drunken idiot. They finish with an exasperated rhetorical question. I've used that word exasperated to give a sense of the tone, the sort of style of writing. They seem exasperated, they're fed up. An exasperated rhetorical question, another persuasive technique there. Making it clear that action is past due. I could have possibly included the quote that they say, how long, to make that really explicit. And they use inclusive language, another persuasive technique. They say we, to make the audience feel responsible for making a change. So that's my how. How have they tried to convince us we need decisive action? Well, they've used these particular words: innocent, drunken idiot, shredded. They've used inclusive language. They've used rhetorical questions, emotive language. So I've described that those language choices. I've described the tone. I've described specific persuasive techniques that they've used, and I've integrated all of that into my own sort of commentary or explanation of how they have put forward their argument. And now the last thing is to say, why? Why have they done all this? How does this work to persuade you? By making us sympathetic towards the victim, critical of the perpetrator, and fearful that random acts of violence can happen to anyone, the writer positions us, again, I've got that word positions, they're moving the audience to a particular side. The writer positions us to desire justice to be served swiftly, right? Their article is all about justice, that they want strong penalties, they want harsh penalties for violent crimes. So it's about justice. They've tried to make it seem like this would be the just thing, and that we need to do it sooner rather than later. They ended with that rhetorical question, how long? I've taken it a bit deeper. The writer removes nuance from the argument. They don't want us to think through the details. They don't want us to think about the socioeconomic background or mental health problems that the perpetrator's suffering from. They just want us to see them as a drunken idiot who shredded the face of an innocent bystander. So the writer removes nuance from the argument, instead desiring an emotional response. They've got all that emotive language, so that we are more likely to support their call for harsher punishments against youth offenders who commit acts of violence, which is their contention. So I've ended with, how's it all designed to make you agree with the contention? So I hope you find that helpful. This is just one example. There's other ways you could have done it. There's other words or techniques that you could have picked out. But the key point is that you say, what point is the writer making? What argument are they presenting? How do they do that? Referring to specific language choices, persuasive techniques, tone, and any audio and visual elements. And finally, why have they done that? Why have they included this argument here? What impact is it meant to have on the audience? And how will it help the audience to agree with the writer's contention? Good luck applying what, how, why to your own persuasive analysis.